So, on another episode of There's a Dog Right Here. Look at this dog. Maxie, look at me. Look at me. Let's take a look at another headline that sparks interest. Can't say no to sweets and snacks? It could be a sign of food addiction. All right, so I want to start this off by saying a couple of facts. 93% of Americans are metabolically ill. They're sick. 93% of Americans have a weak metabolism. Now, what does that lead to? It leads to things like insulin resistance, which can lead to prediabetes, which leads to type 2 diabetes, which leads to death and or slavery to the pharmaceutical industry. And then you've got some other paths that lead to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. 93% of Americans essentially have a precursor to those things. 20% of children, 1 in 5. You know, when I went to elementary school, we had classrooms of 15 kids. So 3 kids would have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in my first grade classroom. 1 in 5 kids have fatty liver disease. Isn't that interesting? That's strange. Now let's look at this. Can't say no to sweets and snacks. It could be a sign of food addiction. About 1 in 8 adults over 50 had signs of food addiction, according to a new survey result. Look at these people. They're like, did you see that? Like, hold up. Am I on TV? Look at these bitches. Anyway. Eating too many sweet treats or salty snacks may sound like something you'd grow out of, but a sizable proportion of adults over 50 say they can't say no to highly processed foods. Now, again, this is a study of adults over 50. Adults over 50. Right? This is not accounting for the generations that were born and raised on fast food and ice cream, like myself, for instance. This is over 50. These are people that when they were young, they probably had a lot of home-cooked meals that are almost non-existent nowadays. People don't really cook at home anymore. That's not a thing, really. And if they do, it's like reheating shit in a microwave from a freezer, which is not cooking, by the way. That's not cooking. About 1 in 8 adults over 50 showed signs of food addiction, according to the survey. The researchers looked at the responses from more than 2,000 adults ages 50 through 80 who completed the university's national poll on healthy aging. More women than men met the criteria for the poll's definition of addiction. Those who said they were overweight, lonely, or in fair to poor physical and mental health were also more likely than others to fit the addiction criteria. It's almost like all of those things are a symptom of addiction. But let's see, what do these terms mean? We need to go into this, because I want to know more about this. Okay? The survey focused on highly processed foods, sweets, starchy foods like white bread, salty snacks, fatty foods, and sugary drinks, but also asked the participants to consider any food they had trouble with in the past 12 months. The ability of these foods to trigger the core classic signs of addiction is on par with what we see in alcohol and tobacco in this older population, said Ashley Gerhardt, an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. We think this is also true in younger populations. Now, again, you ask me this question for under 50, I'm going to say 9 in 10 people are probably addicted. Why? Again, another fun fact, 95% of Americans do not eat fiber. There's a chance you don't know what fiber is if you're listening. Now, if you're a regular listener of my show, you should fucking know what fiber is by now, motherfucker. But hey, what is fiber? Fiber is fruit and vegetables. Fiber is the indigestible parts of real food that you consume, like apple skin, for example, goes through your system and you don't digest it, but it feeds your gut microbiome so that they stop eating the shit that you're eating. What happens if you don't eat fiber? It leads to inflammation. It leads to leaky gut. It leads to poor absorption of nutrients. You are chronically malnourished because the microbiome in your body is eating the food that you're eating and getting the nutrients instead of you. And then they're also causing inflammation because they're bad bacteria that proliferate in a situation where good bacteria die out because you're not feeding them properly, right? So 95% of Americans. So again, those numbers that I mentioned, 93% of Americans are chronically ill when it comes to their metabolic rate. 93% are chronically ill. 95% don't eat fiber. That's a delta of 2% of people that don't eat fiber and are metabolically healthy. I mean, you talk about numbers that are acquired in completely different ways. The 95% statistic and the 93% statistic were acquired by different teams in different contexts with different studies, and yet they pretty much synchronize perfectly. 95% of Americans don't eat fruits or vegetables. 93% of Americans are chronically metabolically ill. And then we look at studies like this. They look at it. Yeah, a lot of Americans are straight up addicted. Now, again, I'm very curious to how the word addiction here is defined. But again, this is a study that looks at over 50. And this is an important aspect of this because these are generations that are way more likely than not to have grown up on home-cooked meals and know how to cook. People that are my age, Zoomers, right, that are younger than me, right, they don't know how to cook. That's a fact. When's the last time you've met a Zoomer that knows how to cook? You haven't. Why? Because they don't know how. Now, again, obviously, there's some Zoomers that know how to cook. But look at millennials. Millennials don't know how to fucking cook either. I learned how to cook for myself, by myself, a couple of years ago. My parents never taught me. Most parents don't teach their kids anymore. Why? Because most parents, they don't know how to cook either. You think my dad or mom could cook? They can't cook shit. So no one knows how to cook anymore. That's great. We're all reliant on garbage. So again, but, you know, I'm just ranting at this point. Let's keep going. Gerhardt and her team used questions from the Yale Food Addiction Scale to measure whether older adults were experiencing core indicators of addiction. Among the symptoms people most commonly checked were: I had such strong urges to eat certain foods I couldn't think of anything else. 24% said this happened once a week. I tried and failed to cut down on or stop eating certain foods. 19% said this happened 2 to 3 times a week. If I had emotional problems because I hadn't eaten certain foods, I would eat them. 17%. Eating the same amount of food did not give me as much enjoyment as it used to. 13%. My friends and family were worried about how much I overate. 12%. My eating behavior caused me a lot of distress. 12%. I had significant problems in my life because of food and eating. 9%. Now, what is one fatal flaw of this survey? Think about it. Write it in the chat, you know? I'm doing a class now, so you got to participate. Raise your hand, everybody. The common theme with these questions is what? Awareness. It's awareness. The way that these questions are asked, they require awareness to be answered. Now I ask this question: how many Americans would qualify for food addiction but not actually be aware of it? Have you ever heard the phrase, "I'm not addicted, I can stop anytime"? So again, let's look back at some other numbers. 93% of Americans, this is not counting 50 and over, right, are metabolically ill, chronically, all the time. 95% of Americans don't eat fruit or vegetables all the time. So, the most common way that addicts talk away from their addiction is by saying, I'm not addicted. I can walk away whenever I want. I'm choosing not to. Right? We all know it. Hey, I've said it. You've said it. We've all said it. So the critical flaw of this study, in my opinion, is that all of these questions rely on awareness. Awareness that the food that they're eating particularly is bad for them. How many Americans are aware of how bad the shit that they eat is? I'm curious. Now again, people ages 50 and older are more likely to have grown up on home-cooked meals, right? Processed food started taking over in the 1970s, right? And it's exponentially accelerated. Fast food started getting big government handouts and all that in the 1960s, and it's accelerated exponentially, right? So if you're 80 years old, you probably grew up on home-cooked meals. If you're 50 years old, you probably had a majority of home-cooked meals. And so you're more likely, as that's how you were raised, you're more likely to realize that what you're eating is bad for you. How about a 22-year-old? How about a 15-year-old? How about a 31-year-old? Do they know what the food that they're eating is really, do they know how bad it is for them? Do they know about things like fiber? Were they ever fed home-cooked meals as a kid, right? These are all major questions that all boil down to the term awareness. I think a lot of people under the age of 50 are unaware that they are addicts. Did you know that the average American consumes 77 grams of sugar every day? Added sugar, I should say, is specifically the statistic I'm referring to. Added sugar. What is the difference between sugar and added sugar? There really is none, but whatever. That's what we study morehand. 77 grams of added sugar. Now, you might not know this, but again, feel free to answer it in the chat. Raise your hand. The actual dietary requirement for human beings, how many grams of sugar do you need every day to live? Just to live, baseline. To make it to the next day. How many grams of sugar do you need every day? 0. You need 0 grams of sugar. Why? Because the only useful version of sugar in your body is glucose. And guess what? Your body makes glucose. So you don't need to eat sugar at all. You can live your entire life without ever eating sugar. Why? Because your body makes it. So the average American eats 77 grams of sugar. The average American child eats 81 grams of sugar. Now, for everyone in my audience that loves drugs, and we're talking about the good drugs, not sugar, think about when, if ever, in your life, have you had close to 3 ounces of whatever your favorite drug of choice is? Think about it. Like, imagine smoking 3 ounces of weed in one day. I mean, hey, I'll sign up for that challenge. The average American child eats 3-ish ounces of sugar every day. Of just sugar. That's just sugar. Not to count the water and the apple juice and all of that and so forth. But once again, you have no necessity to eat any form of sugar at all, especially sucrose, especially fructose, right? You don't even need to eat glucose in the form of carbohydrates. What happens if you don't eat glucose? Your body makes it. And if your body doesn't make glucose, it makes a close version of glucose known as ketones. If you've heard of the ketogenic diet, what that does is it restricts your body's intake of dietary carbohydrate to the point where it doesn't generate glucose. Instead, it generates ketones, which activate the same receptors as glucose. So again, If you eat glucose in the form of carbohydrate, you know, if you ever have a potato, there's a lot of glucose in there, right? Then your body will use it. If you don't ever have any dietary intake of glucose, your body will generate it. And then at a certain point, your body will realize it's better and easier to convert all this energy into ketones, which, again, if you don't intake any dietary sugar, your body will convert all that into ketones, which act on the same receptors. So again, the requirement is 0. The average child gets 80. The average adult, 77. The actual requirement, 0. Now imagine, again, your favorite drug of choice. Let's talk about crack. Imagine someone going through 3 ounces of crack in a day. I mean, damn. Is that not an addiction? I don't know. Hey, man. But let's get back to this study here, because there's more information that I think is interesting. Gerhardt was a member of a group that devised the Yale Food Addiction Scale. The scale uses the same criteria used to diagnose substance addictions and applies it to highly processed food. She says, Gerhardt suspects that ultra-processed food, which are high in fat, sugar, and salt, tap into the brain's reward system, triggering the release of dopamine, the same signaling chemical that makes people feel pleasure when they get enough food, have sex, or use certain drugs. So a real quick, more specification here. Dopamine is the chemical that drives you to do something. The pleasure response is more akin to, you know, serotonin or some other kinds of chemical. Dopamine specifically makes you want something, right? That is separate from having it and experiencing it, right? So the pleasure that you feel when you bite into your favorite ice cream or whatever, you know, it's a lot to do with the fact that you were looking forward to it. Your body was like, oh yes, oh yes. You know, the phrase, the first bite is with the eyeball, right? So if the first bite is with the eyeball, what does that necessitate? That when you look at food, your dopamine is increasing, right? So that's why you ever eat like a big ass fucking fast food meal and you realize it stops tasting good after the first 3 bites? That's because dopamine doesn't need to be there anymore. You are releasing your dopamine. It is going away now because you've already started eating. So it might still taste good. It might still feel good to eat. But it feels better when you have the dopamine. Right? So again, another insidious component of these foods, she said, is that companies strip out fiber and water, which makes it easier for people to consume large quantities without ever feeling satiated. Now, what is a food that doesn't have water or fiber? That's a drug. That's poison. That's it. It's not food. It's a drug. It's poison. Now again, I drink alcohol. I drink coffee. You know, I use all kinds of drugs. But I know that they're drugs. One drug I avoid is sugar. I don't eat sugar. Okay? Sometimes I'll have an apple, but that's about it. But how many Americans know that they're eating drugs every day? Again, 1 in 5 kids has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. 1 in 5, 20% of children in the United States have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Why is it called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? Because when we first discovered this disease, it was a disease exclusive to alcoholics. So it was referred to as fatty liver disease, and you would give it to people that overdrank alcohol. What is alcohol? It is sugar that is fermented, right? And so it leads to the same diseases that sugar does, right? So now we have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is way more prominent than fatty liver disease. They're the same thing. The only difference is one of them is caused by alcohol. The other one is caused by juice boxes. Quote, when you feel full, there are hormones in the gut that turn down the dopamine system. Gerhardt added, these foods don't seem to be signaling satiety, so there's no dampening of the dopamine system. People feel really conflicted and struggle with their relationship with these highly processed foods. Many aren't aware of how powerful these foods are. You can read more of this. This one is weird. Food addiction is considered to be theoretical rather than established science. I mean, I don't even know where to start with that. That's called a quote that someone says just to hear themselves talk. Like, that's not real. There's no value there. I do believe that there are strong parallels between addictive disorders and food cravings and eating disorders. The difference is you can't stop eating food. Now, again, this person, whoever this is, Colleen Schreier, dumb motherfucker. I don't even know who this is. I don't care. They're stupid fucking dipshit for brains. McDonald's is not food. I'm sorry? Cheeseburgers, not food. They're not food. What is food? Can we define food? Can we have a definition of food? Food provides essential nutrients for your body to continue doing what it's doing. What is it doing? Being alive. Okay? If you eat nothing but McDonald's, your body is dying. You are dying. You are dying. Your body is barely subsisting at an extremely sickly rate. It is dying. It's not food. It's not food. It is poison. It is poison. If you drink vodka every day, you're not going to do so well in the long term, in the same way that if you eat sugar every day, you're not going to do so well in the long term. You are dying. Now, again, you can feel like you're not dying because you don't know what being alive is like, because you've probably never went multiple weeks eating like a regular person pre the advent of processed food. So you don't even know what baseline is. How many people in America do you think have gone 3 weeks without eating any processed food, any fast food? 3 weeks. I'm just curious. When's the last time you have gone for 3 weeks, no processed food, no microwaves, no packaging, no fast food, no takeout, 3 weeks in a row? And then let's imagine the average American. The average American. How many times have they done that? So most Americans don't even know what being healthy even is. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say 1 in 8 adults over 50 may be food addicts. It's possible, but I'm willing to say that 95% of Americans are probably food addicts. My definition of addiction may not be what the Yale School has. I don't think you have to know you're addicted to be someone who's an addict. You can be addicted to something and not be aware of it, and you're still addicted. And all of the questions that they asked, the fundamental thing that they agreed on was awareness. How do you feel about doing this? Do you feel bad about it? Right? Most addicts will tell you that they're not addicted. They can stop any time they want. But when's the last time they've tested that theory? When's the last time the average American has tested the theory that they could stop eating processed food whenever they want? You know, food for thought. But, whatever.